There's a high-pitched, punchable-faced English Svengali who manipulated the teachings of a Marxist surrealist art movement from the 1950s to be consistently at the forefront of pop culture between the 70s and 80s and created artistic waves that changed the world several times over. His demented take on this manifesto that was initially written to liberate artists from capitalism led him to orchestrate one of the music industry's most egregious early cases of what some might call cultural appropriation, but I'm just going to call it intellectual property theft. Hi, and welcome to Songlines with Jimmy Trash, Episode 5, Malcolm McLaren in Africa. Hey everybody, Jimmy Trash here, and as you can see, there's a lot more going on in this episode of Songlines. It means that we have worked with a bigger team and a lot more hours spent on it, so it would really help us if you could leave a little tip on the link below and share and subscribe especially. It would really help us out. We have some big episodes coming up, including some traveling, so all of that would be very much appreciated. And now, the episode. So, this episode is going to be an exploration into the motivation of creation, perhaps finding the line where inspiration becomes misappropriation, and also what happens when a philosophy is turned against itself and becomes a mirror image of what its original intentions were. And to start this story, we have to introduce the spectacular ideas of the French art group founded in 1957 by Guy Debord called the Situationists. Led by Debord, the Situationists were a more political, Marxist-influenced version of the Parisian group they had just splintered from, the Lettrists. While the Lettrists sought pure anarchy and smashing the rules and boundaries of art was a raison d'être, Guy Debord's Situationism considered class consciousness, the abuse of free time under industrialism, the brain rot of advertising, and in general, art's ability to be omnipresent in order to oppose those forces of control, whilst carrying on the Lettrist legacy of disruptive actions. Their key concept for us, as we go into the story of Malcolm McLaren, is the Situationists' most enduring contribution to the art and political world, their use of détournement, basically hijacking a public work and reappropriating it, normally by way of graffiti or cut and paste, to comment on the object's original message. And this is literally the birth of meme culture. Its use is now a basic tenement of our online experience. But back then, in the 1950s, it was a radical tool for making people aware of how pervasive and manipulative advertising culture was, in a time when there was not much discussion of that outside of socialist intelligentsia circles, and certainly not in this pop culture context. Back then, in my early 20s, I saw situationism similarly to how it was perceived by young students back in the 1950s and 60s, an extremely hip and exciting alternative to art's role in a leftist society. We have brought up the idea of socialist realism in almost every Songlines episode so far, which was the very policy-friendly, high-moral version of art extolled on much of the communist world through the 20th century. Situationism offered a more creative and viable version of political art. However, I understand now this type of combative art can only really exist in opposition to a status quo. We will come back to the inalienable importance of this art movement in this story, but I don't want to get bogged down just yet in theory. Young Malcolm McLaren also fell in love with the theories of situationism after being introduced to their works by a moneyed South African called Henry Adler, who he met after they were both thrown in jail whilst attending a Vietnam protest. This same guy brought Malcolm along to London countercultural events in 1967, attending speeches by Stokely Carmichael, Ginsberg, Burroughs, Mick Farren from the Deviants. Adler also took him to see the works of Kenneth Anger and Andy Warhol, basically initiating him into the litany of cool kid underground subversive culture of the late 60s. It's also the year he had a child with his partner, Vivienne Westwood, whose name I'm sure you will recognize, and that's a good point to fast forward through some really important events because Malcolm's life is dense with world-changing projects that are not a part of the story I wish to tell today. Between the late 60s and late 70s, McLaren and Westwood single-handedly changed the face of London fashion with their various stores and concepts, including being responsible for bringing the bondage underground into high fashion in the mid-70s. At that time, McLaren had a run in New York as the manager for the legendary glam band, the New York Dolls, who were in their final embers of their career, embarrassingly dressing them up in red communist drag in an attempt to shock the New York scene, and it didn't really work. The New Yorkers were much more intellectual than he bargained for, and it's basically a forgotten time of that band's legacy. It's noteworthy that he dressed the band up as communists, but didn't employ any actual theory in his work with them, something we will bring up again as we become more critical of his exploits. After that, there is the whole Sex Pistols saga, which I just can't start on because it's its own story, but important to our narrative is his role with the punk band as a very public manager who took all the credit for the creation and direction of the band, which achieved momentous chart and sales success in the face of the entire record industry, thus garnering him infinite credit with the music industry, despite the historic levels of infamy attached to that band. The story of the Sex Pistols is a phenomenon, but it's a pop one, and most of the PR stunts of the band were orchestrated by McLaren in direct accordance with what he learned from the Situationist Manifesto. The other thing I will comment on after reading McLaren's biography by Paul Gorman, which is a source for a lot of the information in this episode, is that he has a pattern of being fixated with people and ideas for periods of creativity before dropping them like a piece of rancid meat when he is done with them. We also see a recurring theme, well documented from his Sex Pistols time, that he follows through on stupid, dangerous, illegal ideas that are often in conflict with business savvy, and somehow he succeeds more often than not, which puts him in a situation of being a constant power broker in board meetings to get funding for all of these passion projects. Now we can finally start our story of Malcolm McLaren in Africa. After the Sex Pistols project chaotically derails in the midst of court cases, missing money, the murder charge against Sid Vicious, McLaren escapes the heat and finds a job in Paris sourcing uncopyrighted soundtrack material for porn films. It was a trade secret back then to pilfer from the extremely vibrant East Bloc recording industry for songs due to the logistical impossibility of a court case between the segregated continent. Malcolm's go-to resource was the sound library of the Centre Pompidou, where he aligns himself with 4 music styles which would dominate his artistic career for the next few years, all the way up until his first solo album. Firstly, he discovers the massive Folkways series, an American recording project started in 1948 dedicated to folk and indigenous music and sounds in general. Now an integral part of the Smithsonian collection, and within that collection there are pressings dedicated to bird calls, carousel medleys, and in particular, he learns about the art of square dance calling.
Now let's put these steps together to music.
First and third, couple balance and swing. And promenade the outside ring, the outside ring, the outside ring. Right and left through with a couple you meet. Right and left back. 2 ladies chained.
Secondly, he hears the modern sounds of black recording artists in apartheid South Africa, namely Mbaqanga, the modernized version of township jive, which we will focus on in the final part of this story. Thirdly, he discovers merengue from the Dominican Republic, and probably in the same section of the library, the polyrhythmic sounds of Santeria religious drumming. And fourthly, the incredible, sacred drum rhythms of Burundi, which is what this chapter of our story will follow. Now, this field recording by the drummers of Central Burundi from a 1967 ethnographic album was supposedly the track Malcolm McLaren discovered that started the next chapter of his musical output, and it's easy to understand why. Burundi drumming, alongside all the other folk music styles of this country, is utterly mesmerizing. However, Malcolm McLaren is a serial liar when it comes to his own accomplishments, and I'm sure he heard this rhythm from the French novelty hit Burundi Black. Released in 1971 with overdubbed claves and guitars by the producer Michael Bernhoek, using the very culturally sensitive name Burundi Black as a group name, and his production under the alias Mike Stevenson with the Nordic spelling, probably to throw off any lawsuits. Now, Mike Bernhoek is a fascinating character and a behemoth of the French recording industry, responsible for writing and producing hundreds, maybe thousands of tracks between the 60s and his death in 2002. When I went through his production discography, I actually found even earlier releases where he had used Moroccan folk recordings as the backup for parody songs, so this was already a tool in his toolkit. But all piratery aside, this is a stone-cold killer musical creation. Have a listen, it's crazy this is from 1971, considering where sample culture would be 10 years later. This rhythm was in McLaren's head when in 1979 a young Adam Ant asked to guide him in a kind of mentorship role. Desperate for success, Adam Ant's original shtick of a plucky little bondage boy was making a blip on the punk radar, but not the impact he desired, so he hired Michael McLaren for a fixed 4-week period to be groomed and shaped in his image. McLaren's stipulations included total control over the band for those weeks. He dressed them up in his current aesthetic mania, which was a mix of pirate chic, Native American accoutrement, and French Revolution dandy vibes, so the band got the full overhaul visually, and McLaren makes a very good taste mixtape and tells Adam to write songs copying the styles on the tape, which included American rock and roll and vaudeville tunes, some glam and belly dance, and Burundi Black, the Bernhoek version. That same rhythm was then anglicized into the seminal chart-topping Adam and the Ants song, Ant Music. But before the song would be released, and Malcolm could rejoice in his own cleverness once again, he had already stolen the original band from Adam to pair that Burundi beat again with a project he would focus a lot more keenly on. Led by a schoolgirl he spotted in a laundromat, 13-year-old Annabelle Lewin of Burmese heritage, calling the new band Bow Wow Wow. Now, this next part is pretty grim, so lots of trigger warnings for the next minutes. There's multiple reports McLaren didn't show the extra interest in Adam Ant despite his success because Adam was in his mid-20s and a strong character who wasn't as malleable as the machinations of McLaren desired. The band he stole was younger, and Annabelle herself was an early teen. He made them play the same Burundi beat they had developed for Ant Music, but for a song straight out of the Situationist playbook, the marvelous C30, C60, C90 Go.
Every day I get a brand new show off TV, record and radio. I breeze with the sleeves on my cassette, cause I've got the affirmative magnolia. Man, C30, C60, C90 Go. C30, C60, C90 Go. C30,
This song encouraged tape piracy, a seemingly huge issue for the industry at the time, and it came out on a cassette with a bare side for intentionally taping radio music. If that was the whole story, I'd be in awe, 10 out of 10, no notes, that's cool as hell. But sadly, it was not. Perhaps wanting to recreate the press success of the Sex Pistols scandals, and perhaps because he has no moral compass for his own artistic goals, and perhaps because he is a genuine pervert, or a mix of all three, McLaren gets super creepy with the power he has over these young kids. He pitches to EMI the tape being released with a custom magazine, thus getting the product into news agencies and basically having a market all to themselves. Based on the success he has had previously, EMI vows to financially support the project, and even funnier, the BBC was evidently following him around for a documentary at this time. The themes for the magazine start to follow this sexual liberation for teenagers angle. He pays the male members of Bow Wow Wow to visit Soho prostitutes and wants them to write a report on their experience for this magazine. He even reportedly tried to persuade the band members to take Luan's virginity, which they refused. He announces the magazine title to be Chicken, a clear reference to the clandestine language of Nambla, whilst at the same time selling ads in the magazine to high-end audio companies. It goes on until his lifelong art partner since his uni days, Fred Velmoro, finally speaks out after already witnessing Malcolm proposing the then 14-year-old Luan to strip naked for a photo shoot, and also hearing about another situation in the studio where a mother pulled her daughter out of a photo shoot in tears, stating, "For the first time, I saw a new Malcolm McLaren, someone who seemed concerned to hurt people and was quite unconcerned with their feelings and integrity, who was a greedy person, greedy for power, acclaim, and success, who was casual about the people getting injured or even dying. The student who had been arrested for burning the American flag because, so I thought at the time, of people getting hurt and dying in Vietnam, was now the man who exploited and even gloated over the tearful confusion of an outraged little girl. For years, Malcolm was my most generous and stimulating friend. I owe him many perceptions and ideas, but what he is now is dubious and possibly evil." With this information, I've had to revisit my own thoughts about what situationism offered, considering the closeness of McLaren to this as a working philosophy that I also pulled from creatively my whole life. Within the original world of situationism, the display of soft pornographic imagery was often used in the détournement to bring up concepts about the alienation of desire. That philosophical group was arguably a boys' club, no different from most at the time. And on reflection, it's very easy to critique their use of the female body as a narrow vision of loneliness and desire, which in fact exacerbates the problem they are trying to fix, if only men's alienation is recognized. If that original situationist idea is what McLaren was building on here, it feels like an artistic hijacking of an already fraught sexual political concept. But it doesn't really matter anyway, because this whole output at this point suggests he is comfortable to abuse people of lesser power for his own gain, and it lands me in a hard paradox, because I've really loved Bow Wow Wow. The frenetic guitar, the Burundi rhythms, Luan's percussive vocals that spew situationist poetry is all a killer mix. But after reading how McLaren puts these elements together, the band starts to have some paint by numbers by a mad dictator feeling that I hadn't contended with before. 1981 finds Malcolm McLaren again in New York after surviving a Scotland Yard investigation into his management role with Bow Wow Wow. Continuing his perpetual position of being in culture-defining moments, a contact of his aspires to bring him to the legendary South Bronx community reach-out block parties held under the name Zulu Nation, where Africa Bambaataa was fomenting the earliest seeds of hip-hop turntablism. McLaren's industry position is recognized, and he even gets his own private security during a knife fight which breaks out as he witnesses Africa Bambaataa doing the Mary Mary break before it was ever recorded. Def Jam founder Jazzy J performs on the decks, and for Malcolm, it's the final key to his Folk Dances of the World album. Yes, that was the working title before it became Duck Rock, which tells you a lot about how he perceived the project. It's also very clear he identifies the similarity between the situationists' détournement technique and the art of mashing multiple samples in the music he heard that night. Back in London, Malcolm was meant to be meeting RCA manager Steve Weltman about Bow Wow Wow finally achieving success in the American market, but characteristically he had dropped them for his next obsession, his own solo project. He pitched his travel and recording idea, and with his massive cachet of success still on display in the careers of Adamant, Boy George, who he'd also recently championed, the Sex Pistols, he wrangled a £45,000 advance, about 236,000 euros in today's cash, on an album where his only promises were to play the role of a square dance caller over the top of what would essentially be the first ever world music album. Attached to the deal as a safety device was soon-to-be legendary producer Trevor Horn, whose work behind the scenes with Spandau Ballet, amongst others, was already marking him as one of the premier producers of the time, and Gary Langen, who McLaren calls the Rolls-Royce of recording engineers. So he is more or less gifted a too-big-to-fail entourage. Horn earned a massively expensive Fairlight CMI, an early digital synthesizer with sampling capabilities, one of only 4 in the UK at the time. And when McLaren told him of his ideas for the album, Horn naturally suggested using samples just as McLaren envisioned from the library and feeding them into the synthesizer. But if you think of how those ethnographic records were often packaged, with information about each tribe and the non-Western time signatures and the spiritual meanings of the lyrics, this was much more what McLaren had in mind for the project, with him as the British colonial explorer. Which is why instead he insisted on traveling to New York, straight to Folkway's offices, to inquire about potential collaborators. A chain of events led his team to record a whole night session with 7 percussionists who were legit Santeria priests from the Lukumi cult. The team were enthralled by how much access they had to sacred music. Although I really love a quote by Horn, believing the recording to be useless because he could never find the one in the rhythms to be able to make samples out of it. In general, the famously multicultural New York Niveau was a natural provider for the project, and they were going to find Peruvian pipe players, a Dominican merengue group, and a Colombian marching band, which would all provide samples for the album, despite McLaren trying to hide the fact that he was never in Latin America in press meetings during the release of the album. By the time McLaren found his rapper and scratcher duo that would be featured on the album and subsequent tours, C. Divine the Mastermind and Just Allah the Superstar from the world-famous Supreme team, his budget had swelled to an insane £100,000, 525,000 euro in modern terms, to already begin making promo videos with a who's who of high fashion New York directors. McLaren's team did travel once in this period, going to Tri-State Recording Company in Tennessee in June of 1982 to record a legendary Appalachian family band whose musical lineage went back to the 1900s, called the Roan Mountain Hilltoppers, for the square dance portion of the album. The Birchfield family arrived with several generations of children, reportedly undernourished and afflicted by matching strabismuses. There's quite a bit of footage of this band existing online, and from watching them, it's understandable why they refused the $100 bill McLaren offered them for the session, not trusting the weird Englishman with such high tender, and wanting to get paid in $5 notes.
Dig for the clam. Dig, dig, dig.
Knock a hole in the old tin can.
Alcohol.
No. Say this. Knock a hole
Knock a hole
in the old tin can.
in the old tin can. What's the meaning of that?
Pardon?
What's the meaning of that?
Hit it, maestro! Rock.
The video team shoots McLaren dancing around the ancient fiddlers, and they use the material for promo and video clips, including scenes where the band are clearly confused and not understanding his directions. which seems massively exploitive, as they didn't use that recording and hired a local session band the next day who plowed gator tails of coke and played the kind of hillbilly music Malcolm actually envisioned for the project. I looked up the Roan Mountain Hilltoppers, and there's a number still right there on their Facebook page if any of you want to hire them. So finally, we have the last chapter where all this is heading, Malcolm McLaren finally in Africa. Before starting, I want to set a scene. There's countless South African music and apartheid documentaries. It was a real cause célèbre in the 80s and 90s, but one stands out for me, a docu made by the Shanaki label. It depicts the life of musicians from the year before Malcolm was there. All of the big names of black South African music were exiled well before the 80s. Hugh Masekela, Miriam Makeba, Jonas Gwanga, Abdullah Ibrahim. Any of the breakout stars with a critical voice were out and blacklisted from radio, so the local music scene consisted of groups playing within the confines of their language ethnicities and discouraged by law to play any Western or crossover styles. Large gatherings for dancing were prohibited, and in this docu, there's a scene where bands are playing a public competition with a single white judge for the prize of a goat. And my feelings are, all this massive creative power that was just a few years away from being recognized all over the world was being completely restricted and humiliated. This recorded vision of full-blown apartheid on film, even though it's only 40 years ago, is still so shocking and barbaric that it seems almost fictional. It's so against any notion of the values we think we have as humans, but all of that is within living memory. It's basically a reminder that we are never far away from such atrocities, and we always have to be aware and to recognize and fight against such ideologies. This is the Johannesburg that Malcolm McLaren enters, with his fixer, Phil Hollis from the Defon label, who brings along Lulu Mazilela, a musician tasked with gathering musicians, rehearsing, and basically putting the tunes together that McLaren selected for the recording sessions. Mazilela is actually in the seminal Mbaganga band the Bayoyo Boys, who McLaren already planned to use two songs of, Puleng, which would become the project's biggest hit Double Dutch, and Tsotsi, which would become Zulu's On a Time Bob, both written by Bayoyo bandleader Petrus Manela.
Hey, come on, let's start a big ring, like the Zulus. Zulu, Zulu.
If we line both songs up side by side, it's obvious they have a little extra zing from Trevor Horn's studio work and Malcolm's innocuous vocals, but in general the compositions of each song is completely unchanged, even to the most untrained ear. One thing that stood out for me is that while these sessions in Johannesburg were going on, McLaren invited the whole band to sleep on the floor of his Carlton hotel because as black men, they were subject to curfew laws and he wanted to be able to record and practice on his own timetable. As a human, this must be an experience to acknowledge how many more rights you have over these musicians who are giving you their all for your recording project. But instead, I feel it was just Malcolm fulfilling his domination kink that has been on display ever since we started to talk about him. After those sessions, he demanded to travel to Soweto to work with the famous Mahotela Queens, an area with even more repression and poverty levels, and at that time, recently in world news due to the 1976 Soweto uprising, when hundreds of school children were killed in protest after schools changed the language to Afrikaans. It also led to higher levels of militant organization against apartheid in the area. McLaren knew of the Mahotela Queens, having already plagiarized a song of theirs with Bow Wow Wow, and now co-opted two more songs, Tina Siakanisa, which became Jive My Baby, and Garabe Tsaga Motutsi, which became Punk It Up. And a fifth song was ripped off for On the Road to Soweto, which was originally a song by General MD Shirinda and the Gaza Sisters. After the recordings are wrapped up, McLaren gets his film crew in and starts to shoot between Johannesburg with a permit and in Soweto illegally. While over there, he reportedly shoots by just tossing money around, with stories of him bribing train drivers and eccentric characters in public with $200 amounts. Again, I hate to admit it, but especially the clip made in this way in Soweto is an absolute glorious display of the character and talent of the local people. Just have a look at it here. And you can see it includes the fiddle player Noisy Kanyila, and this is the only way we would suspect he was on the recordings, because as soon as the album, finally packaged as Duck Rock, was released in South Africa, all of the musicians realized they'd been had. The songs didn't include any of their credits as composers or musicians, and adding to the insult, it contained an inner sleeve with an even more vapid take on the classic 1950s style ethnomusicology rap sheet, talking about the story of Shaka Zulu or claiming Soweto people think with their hips and not their heads, making it all sound as if they had never existed except in the imagination of this chalky, pipsqueak English guy. The lack of acknowledgement was bolstered by the lack of any royalty checks, and Phil Hollis, who had negotiated the licensing of the Boyoyo Boys tracks for McLaren with the recording giant Gallo, realized what happened. Gallo owned the rights to all 5 songs ganked on the Duck Rock album. They covered the catalogs of Mahadela Queens and Shirinda too. So Hollis took a lawyer to London, where he was immediately told to fuck off by McLaren. They subsequently sued and were successful to freeze the royalty payments on the album. The court case was active, and Hollis felt he could hand it over to the Gallo legal counsel, one Fred Withers, to finish the negotiations. This should have been a cut and dry case, since Gallo was an official legal body with all rights. You know, this wasn't a Queen and David Bowie versus Vanilla Ice situation.
That's what's making it different. It's totally different. It's a rap song. It doesn't sound anything like theirs. Ding, 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 diggy, ding, ding. Ding, 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 diggy, ding, ding. Ding, ding, ding. That's the way theirs goes. Ours goes ding, 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 diggy, ding, ding. Ding, 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 diggy, ding, ding. That little bitty change. It's not the same.
It was literally the whole songs recorded by the musicians who were involved with the original recordings. The matter was settled out of court, and when the money was never found back in South Africa, blame was shifted down the line of command for the rumored £200,000 that was paid out. Hollis claims he didn't see a cent and reckons the money was spent on legal fees. The Gallo lawyers blamed their junior associates. Mazalela said the Boyoyo Boys composer Manela got paid some money, but when he confronted him, he was also told to fuck off before the songwriter died of alcohol consumption soon after. For McLaren, the album charted fine, dipping around the top 20 across the Western world, and becomes another part of the Malcolm McLaren tapestry. He incorporates the world-famous Supreme team with his fashion shows until he drops them for his next mania. However, in true McLaren style, the album's cultural influence is immense. The mashup production style directly influences Herbie Hancock to produce the massive hit Rocket. Outtakes from the studio team with Trevor Horn basically becomes the first Art of Noise album. The film clip of Buffalo Gals that heavily focuses on the Rocksteady crew's breakdancing literally introduces the street dance style to London crews and births the entire breakdancing scene in the UK. Keith Haring, who did the album cover, and New York graffiti culture in general, receives a huge bump into mainstream appreciation. After its release, Malcolm is accosted by Peter Gabriel for ripping off musicians, but he brushes it off again in his typical style. As a side note, Peter Gabriel had organized the first of the massively successful and still ongoing WOMAD festivals in 1982, partly so the Burundi drummers could get their dues after the amount of influence that clearly had on the English pop culture. Now, we're not quite finished because there is a last funny part of this that I have to include. In 1983, Paul Simon's career was sundowning, and he was producing a young Norwegian woman called Heidi Berg, who was flaneuring around New York between her studio sessions. After one such trip, she returned with a tape of South African accordion jive music, and there was a band Simon seemed to be most fond of from the tape, the Biyoyo Boys. He was inspired so much, he was in Johannesburg a year later in 1984 for sessions with our same dude, Mazilela, who obviously hadn't lost all of his trust in whiteys yet. At the very same time, Steven Van Zandt from Bruce Springsteen's E Street Band and head of the cultural boycott movement Artists Against Apartheid was secretly in Soweto researching and reaching out to the militant resistance unit AZAPO, the Azanian People's Organization. Little Steven found himself negotiating with the group to not assassinate Paul Simon for breaching the cultural boycott and was begging them to give him a year to reach his vision for the Artists Against Apartheid movement instead. Van Zandt would release the song Sun City and push awareness of apartheid forward, but Paul Simon's album Graceland would win multiple Grammys, and his platforming of South African musicians would later be cited much more often as a project that put international pressure on the breakup of the regime. Personally, I think this is utter bollocks. He has a quote from Release Party being asked about recording in South Africa in defiance of the boycott. And his answer, "I'm with the artists. I have a feeling that when there are radical transfers of power on either the left or the right, the artists always get screwed." To me, is such a wildly milquetoast view when talking about an active apartheid. Plus, he called Mandela a communist, so we're gonna throw him in the aging liberal dickbag bin. In the end, there's another reason I really wanted to put this episode together. I've been a vinyl DJ for over 20 years, and by my own calculations, I've probably reached my 2000th vinyl set pretty soon. And all of this started with the first ever record I bought in a secondhand store with my own 50 cents at the age of 14, Adam and the Ants, Ant Music, the selfsame album that contains the Burundi rhythm. My interest in music certainly had an arc that moved from punk into African music, and it's forever a question mark in my head that this anglicized version of the Burundi rhythm was my first experience with musical expression, vinyl collecting, everything. And reluctantly, I have to add my name to the long list of artists this annoying asshole Malcolm McLaren helped to shape and influence. Thanks so much for listening to Songlines with Jimmy Trash. We have big things planned for the future, so please share this, subscribe, and I'll be back sooner than later for the next episode.
Okay, you can start.
Right, name, Bow Wow. Profession, singer. Born, Halloween. Right, go on. Age of piracy.
Fuck off.
Yeah, it really is.
Don't swear on
How old you are? 16. Malcolm McLaren, he's just a bloke.
The only way to create an exhibition of the situation is you have to take the notion into your own heart and redesign it accordingly with your own soul.
Hi, Jimmy here again. I have to make a quick amendment to the script. One of the more controversial parts of this podcast is, of course, Malcolm McLaren's dealings with Bow Wow Wow. Something that was in the back of my brain, but I didn't quite remember from when I was reading about Situationism 20 years ago. The Situationists did push an autonomy for teenagers agenda. It's what links them to 50s and 60s rock and roll and the movements that would happen soon after. And Malcolm McLaren definitely was using that theory in how he was promoting Bow Wow Wow. So I think he's not quite the pervert that we make him out to be, but he is definitely still mutating this situationist theory for his own nefarious goals. So I just thought I'd make sure to say where I lie on that. It was bugging me a little bit. Anyway, thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe. Please lend a tip if you can. And I'll see you next time.